Good morning. Yes, my name is Ben Carlton-Jones. I'm an Associate Director in the Infrastructure Advisory team at KPMG. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the SIP says about funding and financing. Now, as you will now be aware, the SIP is a... The SIP is a very long-term programme. It is a diverse programme. It covers a variety of modes, a variety of geographies, and a variety of delivery models. It's also a programme that will be delivered within a fiscal and commercial environment that already is changing rapidly, and over the course of 30 years, we can expect it to change even further still. Having said that, if the plan is to be credible, then we do need to have as clear a handle as possible on whether it is affordable, whether it is deliverable, and indeed how we will pay for it. And that is the focus of the chapter in the SIP around funding and financing that I'm going to give a whistle-stop tour of this morning. Now, it's not a scheme-by-scheme detailed funding and financing approach. If you're looking for a financial model for each and every scheme in the SIP, you're not going to find it here. But consistent with the approach that's been taken to the document itself and the consultation, etc., it's designed to provide an overview about how we can launch down that pathway to affordable delivery. There are two broad approaches that we take to the funding task. The first is considering how we can make the best use of government funding, and the second is how we can identify new, innovative, fair and equitable ways of generating new revenue sources to complement the money that can be expected to be provided from the traditional government sources. Now, the former, which is government funding, is the way that strategic transport schemes, like the ones that we talk about in the SIP, are generally delivered. This is usually via allocations from the Treasury to DFT. DFT then provides allocations to the major delivery bodies, in particular Network Rail for the rail network and National Highways for the highways network through the generally the 5-year funding settlement periods, the RIS and the Network Rail programme as well. And if you look at historical trends, and that's what this graph on the screen does, the Southeast has done okay. Generally speaking, over the past 10 or so years, the region has received an allocation of funds from government that's broadly consistent with its share of both population and economic contribution. And what we did was we did a little bit of analysis that projected forward some scenarios based upon historic trends to see what that funding could hypothetically look like in the future. And what you can see from the graph, and there is sort of more detail about how we've come up with those numbers in the SIP itself and the supporting annex. But what this essentially demonstrates is that if we were to take such an approach, you could draw the conclusion that the majority of the capital spend required for the SIP could indeed be funded theoretically through a potential envelope of central government funding. And one of the reassuring things about this piece of work is that gives us a bit of assurance that the programme itself, the overall scale of the programme, is reasonable. However, we all know that continued reliance on handouts from government is not going to happen, and indeed it's not what we want. On the one hand, the world, of course, has moved on. The traditional funders of strategic transport investments, be that government departments, delivery bodies, operators, local transport authorities, are operating now in a highly constrained environment. There are numerous competing calls on limited resources, and in some cases across the country, we're seeing very challenging commercial environments for the traditional funders of strategic transport infrastructure. Further national level challenges are, of course, expected to be presented by technological change in the sector, in particular the electrification of the road fleet and the implications that that will have for road taxation and the way that users pay for use of the highways network. And of course, there is the levelling up agenda that was discussed earlier and what that means for the future allocation of funds to the southeast compared with other places. And secondly, there is the fact that the SIP does go a lot further than just providing improvements to transport connectivity and transport access within the southeast. In addition to addressing those issues, it helps promote and maintain economic growth, increasing the supply and affordability of homes, supporting the transition to net zero, and improving quality of life and inclusion. And what that does, it introduces a much broader range of beneficiaries than just the user of the transport infrastructure itself. And of course, that taps into consideration of different ways that uplift in value for different groups of people, different groups of beneficiary, might be monetized and might be leveraged in the future as a source of revenue to help deliver the infrastructure in the first place. For anyone who's interested in the technical annex, which is one of the supporting evidence papers on the SIP website, there is a discussion about what some of those mechanisms might be, where they've been used in the past and how they might be relevant in the context of the SIP. What we do in the SIP itself is to sort of drill down into this question and the evolving relationship between central government funding and new sources of beneficiary-pays funding, as we look at a number of worked examples or case studies which are designed to broadly reflect the different types of scheme within the SIP. So we look at an example of a strategic rail enhancement. We look at an example of a strategic highways enhancement, being the programme of upgrades and improvements on the A34, for example. We look at a context-specific mass transit scheme, which is the extension of the BRT in southeast Hampshire. We then look at a sort of a brand new piece of infrastructure connection, which is the A27 long-term solution around Worthing, which has already been mentioned today. And of course, it won't be a surprise to hear that in that context, we start to look at things like tolling and other forms of infrastructure-specific user charging, which often do have a role for new tunnels, new bridges, and that sort of thing. And then finally, we look at the Isle of Wight ferries investment in the context of the maritime and ports sector and the Avenue Verte scheme as an example of how active travel projects within the SIP may be funded and financed in the future. And what those case studies do is they hopefully tee up a conclusion section in the document, which starts to talk about how this might evolve in the future. And we talk about something called the beneficiary pays continuum. And what essentially it is, it's a request to government to enter into a dialogue with TFSE and TFSE's partners about how we in the region can have a greater role in prioritising and delivering the SIP and the priorities that we have developed locally. And of course, in return, that means having greater responsibility for paying for it. Now, this is, of course, you very quickly get into the complex area of devolution and fiscal devolution when you start to look at these things. We do, of course, recognise that is a evolving and complicated question. It is a question that will mean different things for different partners within the southeast. But the fact of the matter is that places like London and Greater Manchester, which have greater freedom to raise revenue locally through fiscal devolution, are in a position to deliver more ambitious programmes of transport investments and to drive their own direction in terms of how and where and when the funds are spent. So, we're not expecting the southeast to become the next TfL overnight, but the history of devolution in the UK has demonstrated that the more funding levers that are available to local places, the more that can be done to move away from traditional funding, to move away from a reliance on making a case to government for budgetary allocations, and we think that can only be a good thing. So that was, as I said, a whistle-stop tour of the funding and financing section in the SIP. Do have a read of it, and
thank you very much, Ben. Round of applause, Ben.